Hello everyone, today we take a look at the Mongol world and at the Ghingiz and Timurid dominations. Yesterday we incidentally talked about the Timurid army, partly about Timur the Lame, and his historical background fundamentally. Today we'll take a look a bit in general, in a very introductive way, at this system and how it had originated since the beginnings and how it eventually evolved. So this has really no pretense of sort, wants to be just a reflection on this phase of history. So let's start it with the beginning of the 13th century, right? Because it's from this point onwards that for roughly 2 centuries in this vast Eurasian territory that stretched from Central/Eastern Europe to China, was developed the Mongol Dominion, right? That was something that was having an effect on the whole continent, basically, even in those areas that were not directly controlled, and that really changed history forever, and also produced what had been up to that point the largest empire. I mean, territorial in terms of extension. In history. Naturally, also in here, it's as most of the times really senseless to make comparisons in terms of bare extensions, but just think about what it means really to rule over a territory that stretches from the Carpathians to the Pacific Ocean. It's something freaking big. It's also interesting to give a look at the geography of this, also looking at the areas that were left at the outskirts of this. Think about Europe, that actually was acquainted with the Mongols in a very, very hard way. And the parts of Europe that, for example, were naturally also very closely, that suffered the Mongol invasion proper, and those that were just at the gates and saying, wow, what the hell? And also looking at Asia and thinking about Arabia or Anatolia or India. The Indian subcontinent was never quite really occupied by. Eventually, yes, there is the Mughal dynasty that is descending from the great Mongol world, let's say, but it's still it happens in a very different way. Also, there are expeditions definitely into certain areas, and here even in the Ganges valleys and in Southeast Asia, but yet this dominion remains substantially compact in many ways, in mostly Central Asia proper and parts of the Middle East and the Pontic steppes, even the Caucasus, etc. That corresponds roughly to certain balances that were occurring in terms of also powers that were from the other side, etc. So always think at the dimension of the steppes. Here we're not talking really about empires like others that we had seen previously. This is fundamentally a nomadic empire, and it is able to revive itself even locally, chiefly from that source. Right, from that spring, the nomadic spring. So this phase of history is very complex and fascinating to interpret in this sense. Yesterday, when talking about the Timurid armies, we were reflecting on the fact that the Timurid Empire, as many other powers that had, however, to do in part with the Mongol legacy, had this kind of ups and downs related to this ability of channeling the steppes force into contexts, however, that were kind of already more advanced. I mean, think about what Genghis Khan did with China. I mean, it was obvious in here, always the mindset, but also now we will see with the various chunks into which the Mongol Empire is divided do correspond to certain bases of power that are not only nomadic as they had been in the origin. So in many ways this can be interpreted like the old struggle between the shepherd and the agriculture, if you want, obviously in a much more complicated and amplified manner with many intersections, and that's really the point. That is, The Mongols left a great mark in all these territories, but at the same time they were absorbed by more developed civilizations, and this in turn produced something new, something different, an original synthesis, if you want. So thinking, for example, even about the models of power, there is a sort of Mongolization of certain areas that had, think about the Khanate of Persia. Today we will talk about, we're reflecting on yesterday sometimes, Persia is Iranian in its truest, let's say, Indo-European idea. Of course, is composed, but rulers like the Timurids or the Safavids had naturally a lot to do with their not just Mongol but also Turkic heritage and legacy of power, and that was particularly useful because also in order to rule on those sedentary lands. Think about even the Ottomans that are that they have a very different history, but they still have in their need of legitimization this memory of the origin of the steppes, right? So that you find at the same time Mongol traditions, Mongol, Turkic, and obviously prevalently Turkic in case of the Ottoman Empire, but also Mongol and Byzantine elements that are blended together and have this great model at the base that is strictly, or at least it has much to do with the military occupation proper. It's not, on the concept of rule based on arms, right? There is also a let's say, obviously the Mongol Empire comes to expand in territories that were, at least in the Western Eurasia, were Islamic. And this has an impact even naturally in the way the local culture that was Islamic since many centuries and had developed its own symbolisms of power and then theocracy, etc., were combined with this model of the steppe was deeply pagan. I mean, it was really stemming from the ancient tribal conception of the overlord of the steppes that came and ruled just with iron fist and with arms and spreading terror, etc. And this was something naturally that also was part of the propaganda. Yesterday we were talking about the Timurids that basically were the same ones who spread the myth of their ferocity for the sake of deterrence, and that is perfectly normal. It's pretty amusing sometimes to see how when there are people who read these histories, looking at those sources and pretending to apply them, without criticism. Like, you take those things for real just because they're original sources. Let me tell you that this is not exactly history, how history works. Sources are to be criticized and contextualized, and I wonder how anyone could develop a reasonable and objective understanding of these topics without this necessary understanding. So that's why important to look at what's beyond, right? Beyond the mere cultural exteriority that is sometimes even the only one that has survived, because of course exteriority permeates in many ways all levels of culture. But let's say that even just think about monuments or relics of the past, most of the times we get the big things, the big guys who had the money, who had the way of being remembered, to make people writing history for them and all the stuff. And that definitely leave a picture that it's definitely how they wanted to be remembered too, because they were partly and surely convinced of the legitimacy of those even ethical models. But at the same time, reality was way more complex, and at the same time, however, probably way more homogeneous, especially when we take into consideration these great powers. They were pretty solid analogies, and what is interesting, in fact, of this chapter in history is that you can see these constant patterns kind of repeating themselves, in the sense of this, waves of the nomads will arrive, raise everything to the ground, then they kind of or more or less at least, and then they settle, and they turn into sedentaries, then another wave of nomads, and it starts over again. And in this sense, such models of leadership, of rule were perpetrated, were handed down generation by generation to form a continuity, definitely, but also a myth sometimes, in a canon, a legend in the models that themselves. And so how did it start, and why did it start? It's a bit complex. We will not explain it really now, but it's also difficult to look at Mongol history before, even for a long time after the Mongol conquest had started, because the Mongols maintained, obviously, for first generations, this not really necessarily intransigent, but actually pretty primitive and traditional character that also didn't produce much of the sources. There is all the legend, the myth that is developed around them, the origins and all that stuff, but it can be barely accepted as factual history. And also in there you have to understand more or less how those societies worked on the base of many other sources of even anthropology and certain, even though with great caution, proceeding with analogies, etc. So, however, the Mongols were to start their conquests from, they were a people, essentially a nomadic people of shepherds and hunters that during the 12th century occupied this relatively small area in the southeast of the Baikal Lake, along the river Onon, where in fact the same Timurid, eventually Genghis Khan, was born. And it's in fact at the end of this century that this chieftain rose, and managing in this very complicated task to say unified under his own domination all the nomadic tribes of Mongolia, which is a very difficult thing to do, because their lifestyle is definitely set without this sense of let's say, there is actually these cultures are imbued with a very strong sense of overlordship. It's something that stems even partly from religious beliefs that there is this great and mystic, celestial deity from the skies that also in the steppes has this great importance. There is all the warrior model, as we said before, that really plays much into that direction, in the sense that there is an overlord there up in the sky, and then many warriors that fight basically on behalf, let's say, obtaining victory from the heavens in this sense, and having this very strongly military ethos, as all the nomadic peoples basically have, largely as tribal confederations, etc. And also Mongolia was not so actually homogeneous as we think, though. It was a world that we don't have to think as really isolated from the rest of of Eurasia. Probably the real problem is obviously that these populations didn't write, so we don't know basically anything about the details of their of many of us. We struggle even to understand who was who in there, but they probably knew way more about the sedentary world all around than the sedentary world actually knew about them. And this is obvious because they were more hungry, and they needed to spot all the various opportunities that arose. They definitely conceived the steppe as a great highway, right? The idea that they could go really back and forth for thousands of kilometers was something typical of those cultures. Whether you take the Mongols, the Turks, the Indo-Aryans, that was the average, and this happened many times. And the Mongols definitely were closer to the Eastern Empire, to the Chinese one. That also was a huge model of civilization. Definitely had attracted them. Partly, these populations of the steppes had definitely played a terribly important role in Chinese history since many centuries at this point, even coming to rule de facto in China. And therefore there was this exchange. These weren't populations that didn't know what, and especially the sedentary civilization that lived around them were perfectly aware that these guys were dangerous, right? So it's something that for example, that in the West with the Romans had happened in a much more diluted fashion, like what China had to undergo in order to stem these populations was much more problematic. China had a great problem also in having overall a more difficult border to check, and that's why also the Great Chinese Wall and all that was a kind of a national enterprise eventually. But this the concept here is that the Mongols were in strong contact with populations of the sedentary world. If I'm not wrong, the same. The same. There was plenty. So, these were pagans largely, but there were Christians and Muslims and Jews even, and it was perfectly normal in here even to play on religion, to say, okay, let's use this because this may be useful into the political game out there, because that confederation maybe takes that religion, at least in some of their elites, because by the way, these populations, even when it's a bit like even during the migration era meant as the end of the late Roman Empire, you want to think, for example, Germans Christianizing themselves because the people literally Christianized. These things were choices that happened at a very upper level, just to be, to have a sort of presentation card to say, okay, well, yeah, I belong to the club of the acceptably religious peoples you can deal with, so that you can make a sacred pact with them or stuff like that. But then the rest of the population would obviously keep believing what the heck they wanted. But especially, there is no oppositional dynamic in here. It's also extremely stupid to pretend that pagans were opposed to monotheism or something like that. It's absolutely false. All of these peoples were, as polytheists, that is a perfectly monotheistic term to define them, but they couldn't even conceive, because it doesn't make sense into a polytheistic context, is that you can accept every single deity that you want. That's really how polytheism works, which, by the way, absolutely doesn't mean that there aren't things like struggles or persecution, so that it's a free, happy world, because, hey, they're without monotheism. No, it's a freaking hell of a place. Brutal, violent, oppressive, poor. It's something that nobody would have liked being. But it still at least conceives this. Is way more open-minded sometimes than greater civilizations, right? Now we live into the delusion that as more structured and advanced and developed civilizations, we're kind of more open-minded than others. But this is not really the case. Actually, all we take on our shoulders in terms of structure is something that is a burden for us in order to deviate from it, when we have to understand something. These populations were primitive, and therefore they had a very low cultural resistance, and that's why also they transform so quickly. And if you look in history, had some of the most successful empires, etc., you realize that many of them are in their origins characterized by a relatively low level of development, which makes them way more open and receptive and fast growing and fast developing in the sense than others. Look at the Romans. The Romans emerged from a tribal background in an extremely rapid time. They don't even have the time to develop a proper politicalistic phase. And that's the key to their at least in part of their success, because they're not so snob like other civilizations to say, oh no, we are the best ones, so every change is wrong. Those guys were extremely quick learners, and they turned out that this creates original synthesis that is able to overcome even those snobby civilizations. And that's why the Mongols are so successful, because when they invade China, as we will see now, for example, it was definitely, by the 13th century, the most advanced country in the world, probably at least. It was, they learned everything from there, and they were perfectly able to apply them. So even be always aware of deeming someone like inferior technologically, or culturally, when you see that it can basically can learn everything and apply that and even surpass. Because that means actually that it's a stage in which it's already as advanced like you and is even able to surpass you. I mean, the concept of cultural appropriation is probably one of the most stupid ideas that has ever been conceived. First of all, because I don't know any single human being that has ever done everything by his own, like without having learned from anyone else. If anything, because it's born from someone else that teaches something to them. But secondly, intelligence in human minds is based exactly on this, on the ability to learn and to reapply, and that never ceases. So that there is nothing like a culture that is fixed like that, and that is so precious because that's so cool. No, that always changes, and people who are able to understand it, as complex as it is, means that they are already at your same level of development. So let's even stop it with this bullshit of dismissing civilization achievements because someone appropriates something from someone else, right? There is a big difference from learning and copying or stealing, let's say, even intellectually. There is something that makes it earning by right in many ways, or at least that it's how it works for everyone. But this maybe will be for another video, because it's an extremely important topic anyway. So the feat of Temujin to control all of Mongolia naturally came through the natural dynamics of being able to catalyze the interests naturally of everyone into joining, into having. Obviously, it passes also through warfare, through slaughtering, to massacres and killings, etc. So it's a pretty dirty business, as always. But it's also driven by the intelligence of understanding what other people want, and how obviously is even certain favorable conditions. For sure, actually Temujin was pretty lucky and not just capable in the way, as all great leaders, by the way, to exploit certain conditions. But he reaches this amazing feat, and this is really the moment in which the Mongols are. I mean, this is very ideal conceptually, but it's as if that there had been the transformation, the transition of all of these scattered peoples. Maybe they were not even Mongols in origin, ethnically speaking, into a sort of Mongol nation. Let's put it in this way. That was conceived as such simply because it was subordinated, was controlled, ruled to a single sovereign and to a single law. Always remember that in the steppe, doesn't matter what you look like, what language you speak, or etc. But what really makes your ethnicity is the law that you follow, and that tells it all. So, and the steppes are the total blender of any form of ethnicity that was even there, right? So it's no strange to believe that, I don't know, yeah, these were predominantly Mongols, even in terms of genetic heritage and all this stuff, but were definitely Turks. There may have been even Aryans, Indo-Europeans. And that's perfectly plausible. But they were definitely mostly Mongols. So in 1206, Timurid is recognized as Ghingiz Khan, right? So this term would be Ocean. It would mean something like Oceanic Lord, right? So it gives you the dimension. By the way, there are even in Mongol political as well as religious thought this very picturesque ideas that involve this extremely vast planes and surfaces. The idea that there is a sort of universal dimension for sure of overall lordship eventually that gets developed in itself, and that definitely comes close to the religious idea, however. So Genghis Khan, or Genghis, or Genghis, sometimes Khan in the westernized form. I think even, I'm not sure whether it's really Genghis, because sometimes I heard from another YouTuber actually was pronouncing different. Well, whatever. But the important here is that in basically 20 years between, remember that Genghis Khan is born around, I don't really know, actually I think around 1162, 67. I think we don't really know exactly, but those are the years at least that I remember are mostly used, and died in 1227. So basically in this 20 years, from 1206 to 1227, Genghis Khan manages to extend his domination on simply a large part of Central and Eastern Asia, right? And between 1211 and 1215, he devastated Beijing and therefore northern China. Then between 1218 and 1223, he conquered Afghanistan and Turkestan with the cities of Samarkand and Bukhara. So the Chingizid Empire at this point was really, it had extraordinary dimensions at this point. The capital of this empire that remains in the core of the Mongol, let's say, ethnical lands is Karakorum. That is a this is important also for strategical reasons, because still as we were saying before, it's as if the steppes had been this huge corridor, right, that stretches in the north of of Central Asia, that you can take to run pretty easily across the Eurasian continent, and then to descend into other territories that, as you imagine, are the most diverse. I mean, think about Mongol armies going in places like Vietnam, or the mountains of Afghanistan, or the Russian the steppes. So it's very, very different scenarios. And this, by the way, is a testimony to the greatness of Mongol armies and their logistics. I mean, really, the most amazing thing here was shifting and coordinating more than else, because that's really amazing. Because really, every civilization manages to have armies of tens of thousands of men and to move them relatively quickly. But here, the Mongols were really managing a place so vast and to coordinate so many big armies all together in an extremely timely way, and that's really a thing. And naturally, this system was evolving. We were talking about that for Timurid armies, incidentally, but I mean, the idea that from tribalism, from seasonalism, these societies are transitioning, at least in the moment eventually in which they come to live outside of their motherland, into professional societies, and with new hierarchies forming and functioning and taking over and wanting more, by the way, because at the end of the day, these guys are doing it for their own prestige, for their own gain. The the world of the steppe is imbued, perhaps even more than the sedentary one, with the concept of hoarding, of treasuring, simply because resources are more rare in the steppes than in a sedentary world that also is less, it's kind of less obsessed by it. But let's say that the way also much of the political cohesion of this empire stood, in fact, from the leadership that, as we were saying before, was so important exactly because it could exalt the fantasies and the hopes and the expectations of the various clans, to say, okay, if we are strong together, if we are especially under a capable commander, because that's literally what it's all about, now we can go there and sack and pillage and live fat and rich for the rest of our lives. That was the myth, right? The great dream, the great lust, the great expectation, and what brought these peoples into motion. So the lust for glory and for wealth and for loot, for slaves, and so when this naturally comes to an end, things start to change in the meanwhile, and there are new worlds, and there is new knowledge, there is new, let's say, space, in a nutshell. But still, even into this system, it's still the idea of the great horde, right? That great military expedition under the great leader of the hour, that is what still makes the system moving, even when it's sedentarized, even when, in fact, these peoples are relatively changing their lifestyle, right? And progressively, of course, they get absorbed along the way, but still the legacy continues in the political structures, as well as in the military ones. We were noticing yesterday, Timurid armies were basically identical to the ones of Ghingiz Khan, and not because there is a it's a copy, it's an artificer. It's simply because they were drawing these troops from the same sources of recruitment, that is the steppes, these nomadic populations, etc. So at the death of Genghis Khan in 1227, Mongol expansion continues for roughly 50 years under his successors. And in the east, when China was brought under control, southern China, was brought under control, and while in the west, the borders of the empire were extended to encompass the Iranian plateau, Mesopotamia, and Kurdistan. Now, if you know, probably that 1258 is a date of dramatical historical importance. It's the Mongol capture and destruction of Baghdad, right? This is perhaps the most traumatic event in all Islamic history. It's the Muslims hadn't, I can say they haven't been given completely a damn about crusaders, but basically, at least heavily underestimated their strategical threat. The destruction of Baghdad, the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, and all that it embodied, even as basically one of the most advanced and splendid and cities of the time, is really the it's difficult even to express. In fact, Muslim sources at that time use very much this, this rhetorical attitude to say, I can't even tell you like how many people died in the massacre, because if I told you, you wouldn't believe me. So that was the thing, not even quantifying the damage, because it had been devastating, right? And as we know, the Mongols arrive. So obviously, by the way, in the Islamic world, there are fast changes in this point we will see, especially later. But as you know, the Mongols also invaded at least Eastern Europe. They also they at one point they're recalled because the Great Khan is dead, so that stops the invasion of Europe. But telling the truth, and I will have to make a massive video about this topic, I don't believe they would have ventured too far into Europe. They would have managed to, and it's not because of the usual bullshit you can't hear around because Europeans were more advanced or something like that. It has nothing to do with that. It's really a strategical problem with Europe and with the type of this of settlement and wealth distribution and all the problems that was to enter into that land and to conquer it effectively at that distance, especially from Mongolia, and with those relatively with armies that were designed to fight also in certain specific environments, but not really from a naturalistic point of view. I mean, not in terms of landscape or temperatures, etc. The Mongols gave proof to be able to fight literally everywhere, right? Even the myth that the bow gets humid, nonsense. First of all, they knew how to keep it perfectly dry, even when it was snowing and raining. The Mongols invaded Russia in winter and conquered it, so that's not really what humidity, it's a joke, basically. But it's really a problem of all, especially all the castes, the fact that the environment meant, broadly speaking, in forms of human settlement. Mongolian armies were not designed to truly have prolonged engagements in local. Of course, the Chinese military legacy had endowed the Mongols with all the what was at the time the technologically most advanced knowledge, basically, in terms of siege warfare and equipment. In fact, they stormed basically every single place, even the famed fortress of Alamut that the Muslim world said, that's that you can't capture that fortress, basically. It's impregnable. The Mongols arrive and take it, quite simply. So that gives you a dimension half, but that's not the problem. It's not even about technique. It's really about the whole strategic resources you have to invest in a scenario that you don't really need to conquer. Because let's be honest, what was the major gain from a Mongol control of Europe, given what the Mongol bases of power really were, and they had much more pressing problems much closer to their heartland, and Europe was just a peripheral peninsula of Eurasia, so it's not really a big deal. But naturally the Europeans freak out, also because they get embarrassingly defeated at every single battle they encounter with the Mongols. They throw out their best, that at the time was feudal cavalry, and they get annihilated. But it's important to get this broader geographical perspective. The Mongols eventually also expand into what would be the plains between the north of the Caspian and Black Seas, though the Caspian one is a lake, actually, but and also definitely in Europe, the place that suffered the most from the Mongolian invasions is Russia. Very, very obviously. I mean, the whole Kievan Rus basically gets to become a vassal state. If what was left of it, Kiev, that was by far the largest and most powerful city in Russia, gets destroyed. I made several videos actually on medieval Russia, and especially telling the differences between, the transition between pre-Mongol and post-Mongol Russia that are very important. So if you're interested, just go out there. There is a playlist. I think it's either in medieval Slavs or medieval Russia, so that we don't waste time now. And I will keep addressing these topics, by the way. So since the first decades of the 13th century, on the base of those lands that had been assigned by Ghingiz Khan, to his own four sons, um, there was the definition of four, you know, well distinct areas of domination, the so-called Khanates, right? So having this, the basically a Khan ruling in there, and theoretically the Great Khan, the overlord of them, and this basically encompassed all the Mongol Empire as such. And let's give a look at them. Actually, let's remember this before that. Starting from roughly 1260, there was the loss of any real political administrative coordination between these four imperial regions, right? And all of these three areas basically started to have a sort of an autonomous life. This is important because, and we will reflect afterwards on it, and it's interesting how these conquests were fairly short-lived. This has partly to do with that cycle that we were talking about before, of the transformation of the nomad into a sedentary, etc. And but it also is deriving from other further considerations. Okay, make of how these steppe empires were born. So it was not really a very long-lived empire. I mean, obviously the Mongol legacy was massive, deeply rooted, and extremely influential, but still the real cohesion of this empire was realistically also not feasible. Also, everything was held together. I mean, I think one of the greatest difficulties to for us as modern people to understand how this thing really works is that we need to believe that there is a sort of central government to make things work, because now we are in an industrial society with a nation state. So for us, it's the idea that everything has to be literally controlled with certain presence, which is really not even true in our own times, but obviously at the time was much more, and everything had even a sort of familial cohesion. Think about the Khan, the Ghingiz Khan's dynasty. That is what becomes basically a certification of leadership, because it was deeply felt even among these peoples, the concept of belonging to a stock, to a clan, to a family that had the same blood. And this is something that lives on. It's like this happens similarly in history, and it's typical even of certain powers that have some of not necessarily theocratic tendencies, but I mean the idea that there is something more in your blood for being the descent of the great conqueror that eventually was guided by the divinity, and also has this origin. I don't know much about Mongol totemism, but I suspect that there is also something to do with this sense of there was at least a spirit within a certain individual that could be passed on in terms of particular sensitivity in contact with the divinity, at least, etc. But I will have to check this. By the way, in the meanwhile, consider that the Mongols get converted to Islam in the West, at least, and they also have and this happens actually everywhere. They take the religion of the local place. Also because it's, for all the conquerors, it's always like that. These Mongols were a few, demographically speaking. There was like the Germans in the migration years. Not that they could really oppose a different cultural model, if not basically settling in places that were kind of similar to the ones that they came from. So they turn into whatever they ruled in. And still, however, in all this lack of cohesion of the empire, there was the formal recognition of the primate of the Great Khan. Now, why did this happen? Well, of course, because it was, as we said, a source of legitimization. I mean, the idea that if I dismiss the idea that I rule in virtue of being part of the great family that came to achieve this, that is pretty legendary and absolutely unprecedented. Um, I also undermine my own legitimacy as a ruler, because who am I at that point, right? Also, nobody quite accomplished the same, really the same feats of Genghis Khan, if not his immediate successors. I mean, they're comparable, but there is obviously the myth of the origin, and also the most obvious realization that this khanates into which the empire had split were not as powerful as the other one. And that is important because the overlordship was based exactly on this as a political thermometer, let's say. I mean, the idea of how much do you actually control? That's how you measure a leader, and that's not something you can just wish for, or having a name, let's say, to boast. I mean, obviously, you must have something more, and real power and concrete power, because that was whichever religion you took it from, that was the divine will for you to be in that condition, right? So let's look, for example, at the Khanate of the Golden Horde that we also encountered a bit more frequently than the others. This stretched in the western area that encompassed basically what would be today's Russia, between the Ob and the Volga rivers, and also parts of Kazakhstan, the Ukraine, and even Romania, right? Because it stretched even, it also fluctuated. Of course, it didn't remain always in the same way, but you know that basically the steppe stops, excuse me for the game wording, into the Hungarian Puszta, right? And that's, I don't know, probably it's the worst terrible pronunciation I could give. I'm not even sure it's correct, but I mean that the Pannonian Basin, the Hungarian plains are where really the steppe, even environmentally speaking, ends, right? And there are the Carpathians in the middle, but still you can't pass through. And that's what several peoples, and not just the Mongols, telling the truth, had done. And then there was the Ilkhanate, so the white one, the Ilkhanate of Persia. Persia would be roughly around today's Iran. So you can pass, in fact, parts even actually of Iraq by large. I mean, besides Iran and Turkmenistan, and Pakistan and Afghanistan, or at least southern Afghanistan, because then Afghanistan always was kind of a very difficult line to control. The northern part was not occupied, at least by those who ruled from that side. That was occupied by the other one. There was the other Khanate. There was the one of Chagatai or Chagatai, that basically correspond to today's regions of Kazakhstan, or better, southern Kazakhstan, eastern China, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and northern Afghanistan, in fact. And then there were the territories that were controlled directly by the Great Khan, that were stretching actually in the steppes proper, or well, not just, but mostly in the original territories of Mongolia, also south eastern Russia, at least today's southeastern Russia, China, and Korea. So these were the four chunks. So the Mongol Empire in itself had brought alongside with it great changes, as we said before, also for the peoples that lived out at its outskirts. The Mongols had accomplished a feat that was very important had been dreamed by all the great powers out there, that had been the unification and the relative pacification of the Asian regions. Mm. So we have this name of Pax Mongolica, as it was known in Latin, the Mongol peace, that naturally was, just echoing the Pax Romana, right? The idea that effectively the Mongol Empire brought to, the term pacification is always like, it's not that really wherever the Mongols arrived, it was automatically peace. This was, sometimes they razed everything to the ground, so that comes alongside as a consequence, but generally speaking, there was a solid order, right, in this empire. As long as armies could be quickly deployed to crush rebellions and stuff like that. But naturally, it was still a very wide territory to encompass. Sometimes the overlordship was nominal. There were many vassal states, and they kept doing whatever they wanted in some measure. But the greatest goal of the Mongols that was extremely important for the economy, and basically all the great empires had always tried to do, was to secure the Silk Road. That's in a nutshell what basically all China and Europe and whoever ruled in the middle in Persia had tried to do. Control the Silk Roads. And to have this great and unique control of these routes under your command, because that was as long as everything, the Silk Road passed through places that were ruled by different governments, well, that obviously equated to lose part of the profits, right? Excuse me, I drink a little. That's why the Romans, for example, and the Chinese wanted to destroy the Persians, because that they were these guys in the middle who basically exacted tolls from the intercontinental trade and took them away, stole them from those other great empires. So now there was only one route. The taxation was relatively weak overall, right? So and this opened the definitely in secure trade. I mean, there were many. It was the same Mongol rule that had, as we were saying before, this fame of violence, for which and of that was fearsome and feared, because if any had rebelled, it would have been annihilated for the sake exactly of the deterrence, right? Which wanted to stress that even, I don't remember how the story was, if a virgin had crossed even all the lands of the Khan, nobody would have ever touched her, because, there was the Khan there, knowing everything, and if someone had harmed her, she would have, it's obviously a very pious illusion. Nevertheless, there was, for real, this great opening of the intercontinental trade, right? And this triggered, in part, especially during the 13th century, so the peak of Mongol rule, the contacts between Europe and China at this point were really massive, right? The caravan routes were pretty safe. There were many travels were carried out from Europe towards Eastern Asia, and also part of this thing started to encompass the maritime trade. Even there were larger expeditions by sea along the coasts of the Indian Ocean. The greatest and most important travelers were the Italians at this point, who wrote also a lot of things about those worlds out there that before were not known. We made many videos on the Italian trade, especially during the 13th century, that had this primary importance for European development, etc. And let's remember, for example, the Franciscan friar John da Piano Carpini, that was sent actually by the Pope himself to seek contacts with the Great Khan's government between the years 1245 and 1247, that passed through this eminently the terrestrial paths. I mean, ways through up to Karakorum, right, and leaving this very very beautiful account of his experience in this travel to the Tartars, as it was called. And the Pope, yes, the Pope, because at this point the Europeans were basically trying to convert the Mongols. And this is something that was even taken into consideration by the same Khans, because of at this point they were still kind of pagan. You know, this is the phase where the Mongols are still relatively, you know, their ideal is still the one of the steppe, for which all, you know, all faiths and all beliefs are to live harmoniously. But the problem is that when this gets applied in countries that were, for example, deeply of some other religion, like Muslim, for example, this was causing serious problems, because obviously that was kind of apostasy, but at the same time it was kind of less, you know, let's not fuel too much the myth of a good savage. Actually, the Mongols were stressing that locally, because they thought that with other communities they could kind of counterbalance all the others. So, and that's why, for example, in Ilkhanate Persia you find so many I don't know, Byzantines, Jews, Armenians, Italians, that were brought in there exactly to, well, first of all, naturally also to stimulate trade and wealth, etc. But at one point, the local Muslim population gets sick of this, and rebellions start. All the various aristocracies, ethnic Persian aristocracies start to rebel. So basically the Mongols understand at that point is that if they want to reign there for a long time, they can't always fight against a religion that is deeply rooted in there, and therefore they had to, let's say, you know, do without their initial tolerance that naturally, as we said many times, actually in Schwerpunkt, it's never tolerance in the modern sense of the word. This didn't really stem from a basic, you know, interest of human rights and things like that. I mean, ask about human rights to the Mongols when they made piles of skulls of you know, civilian populations slaughtered in hundreds of thousands at a time. You know, that's not really the point. That was a form of tolerance. I mean, the one that existed in the Middle Ages stemmed from the need of a political balance, as we said before. That is to say, if you are a community that by staying here kind of counterbalances the power of this other one, and you have a different religion, it's fine. And that was also an interesting way to actually to draw heavily, for example, from many different cultures and traditions that brought alongside with them knowledge and you know, science. The 13th century is a pretty advanced time at this point. So that was a very profitable asset. For example, the Mongols were totally fascinated as a people of the steppes with astronomy, right? And they, because basically in the steppes that are pretty flat, obviously they had many means of orientation, etc. But much of these people's you know, imagination and dimension stemmed really from the skies, because the skies were there was the great celestial deity there, and they had to be interpreted, and they had even to orientate themselves with the stars in many ways, just stretching thousands and thousands of kilometers in the steppe in a relatively short time. And when they get into Persia, and even they get acquainted with the sects that were particularly advanced in astronomy, you know, that Persia has a millenary astronomic tradition of studies, etc. The Mongols began to absolutely to read everything they could about it because they were totally fascinated, and therefore they unavoidably get acquainted even with this other beliefs and ideas. That especially in Persia, the Shia sect was imbued with Neoplatonic knowledge and studies and ideas of the world, etc. So it came a bit alongside all with this belief that because they were all mixed at the time. At the time, there is no difference between science and other things. They believed that this was not just a pretty rational knowledge, but that it contained in itself a higher knowledge, a superior knowledge that could even make them reach a greater power than the one they already had, because at the end of the day, that's always the same thing. Between the years 1260 and 1295, there are also these other very famous Venetian brothers that are Matthew and it would be Matteo and Niccolò Polo that are and also of the son Niccolò's son, actually, there is Marco, that narrated these travels to China in the famous Dominion in 1298. There is a lot of criticism. There are people who say basically that these merchants didn't quite leave. They never quite reached China, at least it's all part, because effectively at this time it was full of this books about journeys, about the East, all these legends related to this mysterious, exotic, magic Eastern world where all the marbles were, and etc. But this is particularly meaningful because basically the Million tells about the first expedition between 1260 and 1269 that at that point was motivated chiefly by economical interests, commercial interests, because at this point these merchants imported obviously goods that were unknown in Europe from China, and bringing others that the Chinese wanted. And this first expedition brought Matteo and Niccolò up to Karakorum in the presence of the emperor. And in the second one, instead, the one between 1271 and 1295, also Marco participated, and he allegedly remained there at the court of the great Khan Kubilai for 17 years, right? Kubilai was roughly between 1260 to 1294, right? That's the period. So, and he was, and basically Polo made allegedly a career at court, and this is particularly fascinating because he is used as ambassador. He has even some other tasks, administrative ones, but chiefly diplomatic ones that bring him to travel for many regions of the empire, and therefore making him acquainted with the knowledge of the East that eventually the Million would have that eventually offered to Western society. It's a beautiful work if you ever take to read it. It's fascinating because it's really seen through the eyes of someone who lived into the end of the 13th century, and that tells you how compatible. We know, by the way, that there were Christians in there. There were even Franciscan missions in there that stayed there in China, and we don't really know much about it. I mean, we know something, but eventually there was a counter repression in China towards this. The schools were closed, but this was a moment in which there was, without borders of other, let's say, of other political boundaries, let's say between the East and West, the this very deep exchange between Europeans, especially Chinese, right? So the 14th century witnesses the progressive decline of the various Mongol dominations, which highlight definitely and can be explained through two factors of weakness that are inherent in the conquests themselves. First of all, there is as we mentioned before, the disproportion between the numerical exiguity of the rulers and the width of the dominated territories, right? So the Mongols, they weren't really very much, and especially compared to the most developed and fertile areas of places like China and Mesopotamia, etc. And secondly, that we also mentioned already, the difficulties in the integration between essentially a culturally nomadic population and the one of sedentary peoples that were subordinated to it. For example, the Yuan dynasty, the Mongol Yuan dynasty of China, that ruled over the region between for 1 century practically, was overthrown between 1365 and 1368 and obliged to basically take shelter beyond the frontiers in their land of origin, basically. And it's after a peasant revolt, in fact, that in 1368 on the throne of Beijing arose the Chinese Ming dynasty that in fact addressed with success its own efforts to revive especially the most penalized economical sectors, those at least that had been penalized by the Mongol government, that had been respectively agriculture and manufactures, right? Because the Mongols definitely brought alongside with them their nomadic traditions, also with cattle, livestock, and that was mostly about. So in this case, you realize that there are various degrees. Probably, let's say in China, the contrast was greater, probably because originally speaking, let's say China was closer to Mongolia, right? So basically, the Mongols could rule theoretically with a higher, with a stronger iron fist, or at least with this easy capability of intervention. And the areas in the West instead were fairly immediately acquainted to the local culture and civilization. And it's not that it wasn't that the transition was necessarily and particularly peaceful at all, but still it was kind of more progressive, and still it immediately started perhaps with a bit of more of greater flexibility, at least, given the most obvious understanding that that they were way more far from the lands of origin, and if they wanted to cope with the locals, they had definitely to assimilate to them more quickly. So it's in this scenario that yesterday we talked about the Timurid Empire, because if, for example, if the Ilkhanate of Persia and the Chagatai Khanate hadn't been in crisis, it would have been impossible, for example, to have the political and military rise of Timur Lame, right? And he was, by the way, a Turkic / Mongol ruler, really, and we know he was actually a Turk, but he was very, highly revered. Naturally, the Mongol legacy. He also married a Mongol princess, and he tried everything to be assimilated to Mongols, but he never, for example, acquired, the Khan title, because it didn't belong to him by lineage. He was known as Timur Lang or Lang in Persian, so hence Timur the Lame kind of has this consonance with English. He was born in 1336 and died in 1405. And he started his empire in the sense from Transoxiana, that we have seen this area bordering roughly today's, in the middle between Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, and Tajikistan. Right. By the way, very tough terrains. We were saying yesterday, for example, one of the most important cities was definitely Herat in Afghanistan, and that's those are tough grounds, and that tells you even how certain places make there is necessarily to be a contribution of the local civilization or another to achieve this domination. So what is fascinating about Transoxiana, by the way, the real capital was Samarkand in the Timurid Empire, but there were, here when we say capital, it's relative. There were greater centers of political and administrative coordination that obviously grew in importance, but as bases. But naturally, there were several centers, also because these armies were constantly on the move, and the whole leadership of these empires was based on moving with the army, right? So the courts really traveled around. But Transoxiana as the core landing here is particularly fascinating. We were telling yesterday, because it's really a perfect hybrid between nomadic and sedentary civilization, right? As well as between Mongols, Turks, Indo-Europeans, and it's a place where you have a bit of one of the other. And these were even with I always say like Khwarezmia, better than Khwarezmia, how it would be said, that were, very developed at the time, and at least fairly developed in the sense, even if you look at art and science, many people came from those places, because this had revived their importance as a crossroad, right? The Mongols had arrived there, also razing to the ground places like even Merv, that was the largest city in the world at the time. Those plains over there weren't the steppe. They were a perfect mix within the two, right? And it's from there that this other great Timurid domination lasts since up to roughly basically 1 century, because from the death of Timur it's 1405, and then the last Timurid ruler is in 1407. But at that point it had kind of in 1507, but the power had shrank compared to the original empire, so it's even difficult to time that, depending on the various places. But however, it was an enormous empire. Between 1380 and 1401, Timur led this incredible military campaigns in the name, by way of Sunni Islam, because that was also a deal that technically, still the Mongols placed themselves in continuation with the Muslim orthodoxy. That was their choice, but they generally, at least in the area, and they built with a perpetration of devastations and terrible massacres this enormous empire, and in fact took the name of his own ruler, Timurid, that founded a new dynasty. So this was also the idea, because we've seen that Timur armies were pretty much like the Mongols. They weren't quite the same thing, but culturally speaking, they were still coming in mindset from the origin. Even Timur's from the steppes. I mean, even Timur's life in many ways it's fairly similar to the one of. I mean, there are some important differences, but it's still kind of similar to the one of Temujin, of the young Ghingiz Khan, because it's still they both started from pretty dire straits at a certain point. I mean, Temujin was someone who was overthrown from his. He was noble actually, which Timur really was. I mean, he came from a humble background, so these are meaningful differences. But even Temujin at a point was out there in the wild, ostracized and obliged to just to feed himself with carcasses and robberies and stuff like that. Well, Timur began like that. Even his name, Timur the Lame, nicknamed the Lame, it's because he wanted to do one of his robberies. He was wounded at his hand and at his knee, which, by the way, in 1941 the Soviet archaeologists, said it was true. Really, actually looking at his corpse, his remains. So it's a bit like it's the myth of these stories, right? That's the legend saying, right? We don't really know, but it's evident that there is a sense of emulation of the great Khan's life and origins and lifestyle that was at the very base of the political authority and legitimization. This is important. If you want to rule over an empire in there, you can't be just, an everyday guy, or maybe just, being kind of intellect. You have to be a bloodthirsty motherfucker that slaughters everyone who has in front of you. So that's also the side of the, the darkest side of these empires. The Timurid Empire, just as much as the Mongol one, were born in blood. Let's be honest about it. We don't have to hide behind saying, well, this was still a great empire. Yes, of course it was. And great empires can be as bloody as hell. So, and there were many other ways to make it. That's what we often forget as well. It was a freaking brutal world on its own, so that these guys weren't just doing particularly wars, because as we've seen, that was probably even fueled as a concept by themselves to say, okay, don't mess up with us. But that were done just in, maybe at once in these bloody massacres, but it still was what everybody did on a smaller scale, regularly everywhere. So simply these guys did it better, and in a way that evidently was, that won them the empires that they built. But still, these empires cannot be conceived through pure violence. They have to be understood even in the cooperation, co-participation of these various elements that were dominated, roughly. So that there wasn't a mere passivity. It's naive to pretend that in the 14th century, an empire could be held just with fear. That helps, but you still need a base of some other type. You still have to share, and in great part, actually, if you want to be honest, and that's why all these empires were at the end of the day fairly short-lived, is that they were created by these conquests because everybody joined you as long as you could lead them as an effective leader, which meant conquering and slaughtering. Then when you settled down, you had necessarily to transform into something else. And what these empires failed into is, in fact, was to create something more stable. I mean, the great empires, the future here, we're talking about for the 14th and the 15th century, was evidently something else. I mean, China is the future as a model. The Ottoman Empire is the future in some model. The European modern state is a model. Even the Safavid Persia is a model, but the Empire of the Steppes is not going to be the answer for long-term development. During the 16th century, the steppe gets conquered. I mean, literally not all of it, of course, but conceptually. I mean, the idea that, for example, pike and shot tactics can ask Timofeyevich, if I'm not wrong, that conquered all Siberia or Siberia, Siberia. How did I come out with the conquered for even the terrible? Was also worried a bit about it, but the idea that that specific model was being overrun at the end of the day. Still, the nomads dominated the steppes for many years, or for a long time, but evidently that model just fueled itself just through victory and loot and plunder. Couldn't be the most propositive model. That's why these things were short-lived, because you could conquer even the sedentary land, but the sedentary land would keep growing even after this terrible razing to the ground. The steppe wouldn't. So it obviously had this ability to replicate itself generation by generation, sending out other looters and pillagers and so on, and find warriors, because that's what they were. But that model doesn't survive at in front of the great solid centralized empire with a professional army, a centralized bureaucracy, etc. That's why it remains, for example, in certain areas, especially eastern Iran, remains heavily with these models. Still, the western part is kind of more advanced, but progressively modernity makes this model anachronistic at the end of the day. And we see in here, in fact, that it hadn't gone further even into the Middle Ages, more than much. There is to say that there's another big and third reason we didn't tell before about the fall of the contraction of the Mongol Empire specifically, is that obviously all Eurasia was invested by the Black Death. It seems there had been a sort of possibly coldening of the climate. I mean, even certain economies in places like Iraq or Iran were kind of declining. So there was part of Eurasian continent transforming. So probably the empire really lacked the resources at one point, or there was no way it could last and be so extended so much, because it's simply the economy and demographics had shrunk, and there was no way this thing could be maintained together with resources that were now evaporating, basically. So that was probably a very important way, and that's how it brought. I mean, the collapse of the empire brought to the political fragmentation. The Silk Road was all now was closed because of all these various powers that began once again, despite being Mongol themselves fighting. I mean, at least the same ruled by the same dynasty, fighting against each other, and there were other solutions in this sense, because eventually this is the same time Europeans began geographical explorations in the Atlantic. They tried to reach the Indies by sea and not by land anymore, because obviously it had become too costly. So this really changed a lot, and would trigger certain scenarios that we definitely know. And that's where modernity starts from. It's in here. In the late Middle Ages, there were models that were meant to survive and to go beyond. Medieval civilization is something that is extremely resilient. It doesn't end with epidemics like in the 6th century, like the ancient world. It goes on. 14th century doesn't bring an end to medieval civilization. It makes it take a step forward and develop something that would evolve into what we call the modern world, but is essentially a medieval response to crisis, right? And that's the winning model, right? Not these ones. So, thinking about the Timurid Empire, just here I have some map, but basically this empire stretched from Euphrates to the Indus, from the Persian Gulf to the Oman Gulf, and up to the Caucasus. So even this empire, after the death of Timur basically didn't quite collapse. I mean, the Timurids kept governing, but it went towards a very speed decline, because these territorial conquests were brought together by military occupation, and by wars rather than by a political or administrative coordination. So once that was exhausted for whatever reason, well, you had to accomplish something. You couldn't go on simply like that again. All right. So okay, for today, I think it's over. I mean, obviously we have to talk about this at one point again, but this was just to frame a bit the context. It can be useful. It can give some answer to general understanding of this period. So I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.